So this is the lecture for Chapter 11, the Muscular System. And we'll start with a brief introduction and overview. So there are approximately 700 muscles in the human body, and unlike the bones that we covered in previous chapters, you are not going to need to learn the names of all of these muscles. In fact, in this chapter, we're going to focus mainly on fascicle arrangement within muscles, how muscles work as levers, and the classification of different lever types, and then some important muscle system terminology. And the muscles that you will actually be tested over from this chapter are the same 36 muscles that you need to know for A&P2 lab. So important to note, we are not covering all of the muscles listed in this chapter, and this chapter is only going to account for about 20% of exam 3. The other 80% is going to be chapters 10 and 12. So in this section, we're going to look at fascicle arrangement within muscles. So if you recall from chapter 10, a fascicle is a bundle of muscle fibers, which is the same thing as saying a muscle cell, within the overall skeletal muscle organ. So if you take a look at a skeletal muscle, the entire muscle, and you break it down and look on the inside, remember the outside of the muscle was wrapped by the epimysium, and then on the inside we find these bundles of muscle cells, and these bundles are called fascicles, and the fascicles are surrounded by the perimysium. So in this section of chapter 11, we're talking about the arrangement of fascicles within the overall muscle. And at the bottom here, we just have a slide picture that shows you a fascicle is a bundle composed of a bunch of muscle fibers, aka muscle cells, and it's surrounded by perimysium. So if you look at the individual muscle fibers inside of a fascicle, they're always going to be parallel, so they're going to run the length of the fascicle. But the overall fascicle, so the overall bundle within the skeletal muscle organ, so this larger organ level, can actually vary. So we're going to look at the different arrangements of fascicles in this section. So the first arrangement we find in what are called parallel muscles. And in parallel muscles, the fascicles are parallel to the long axis of the muscle. So basically, you look at the muscle, you find the long axis, so the axis along which it's got its greatest length, and all of the fascicles are going to run parallel to that. Most of the muscles in the human body are parallel muscles, and there are two shapes to parallel muscles. The first one is a spindle shape where you're fatter in the middle and then you taper down to both ends, and you have a fat middle portion, which is called the body, is also can be called the belly. The other shape is a very flat muscle. Again, the fascicles are still running parallel to the long axis. That's what makes these all parallel muscles. But in these, the muscles are actually flat and they have broad attachments to bones. So these would be attached with aponeuroses, and these got the spindle-shaped ones would be attached with tendons. So within the flat muscles, there's actually two types. You get parallel flat muscles that actually have tendons throughout them. So you have these tendinous bands. An example of this would be the rectus abdominis muscle in your abdomen. And an example of the parallel muscle with the spindle shape would be the biceps brachii in your upper arm. And an example of a parallel muscle that doesn't have the tendinous bands, we call these wrapping muscles, would be the supinator, which is in your forearm, and it helps supinate and pronate your forearm. Contraction of a parallel muscle results in shortening along the entire long axis of the muscle. So since all of the fibers and fascicles are running in the same direction, there is only pull in one direction. In the second type of fascicle arrangement is what we call a convergent muscle, and the fascicles in this type of arrangement extend over a broad area, so like a fan shape, but they all converge or come together onto a common attachment site, which would be a tendon. So these muscles are versatile, but they are not as strong as the parallel muscles. And the reason they're versatile is because if you stimulate different parts of the muscles, like if you stimulate just the top part, you can change the direction of the overall pull. So if we take this pectoralis muscle that we're looking at here, if I extended just the top part, I would pull in this direction. If I extended just the bottom part, I would be pulling in this direction. If I extended just the middle part, I would be pulling in this direction. So you can change the direction of pull by stimulating different parts. These are typically shaped like a fan or a triangle shape because they're broad on one side and they narrow down to a single tendon on the other. But if the entire muscle contracts, the overall tension is not as strong as you would get in a parallel muscle because each of these fascicles is pulling in a slightly different direction. So if the overall muscle contracts, you've got fibers up here pulling this way and you got fibers down here pulling this way. So they're all pulling in a slightly different angle, so the overall contraction is not as strong. The third type of arrangement is called pinnate muscles. And in pinnate muscles, the fascicles form an angle with the tendon. So in the previous two shapes with parallel muscles, the fibers were parallel to the tendon. In a convergent muscle, the fibers were spread out, but they converge onto a common tendon. In pinnate muscles, the fascicles form an angle with the tendon. So there are three types of pinnate muscles. In unipinnate, uni means one, there is one tendon and all of the fascicles are on the same or single side of that tendon. An example of this would be the extensor digitorum muscle in your forearm, which extends your fingers. And so again, we have the one tendon shown down here, and then notice how the fascicles are coming in at an angle. With a bipinnate muscle, the fascicles are on both sides of a central tendon. So the tendon is shown in white, and it actually runs all the way up and down, even though you can't see it. And you've got muscle fibers coming in from both sides at an angle. And this is the most common type of pinnate muscle. Remember, parallel muscles are the most common type in the body. And then there are multipinnate muscles. This is when you actually have more than one tendon. So with these previous types, you just had one tendon, and I forgot to mention the rectus femoris is an example of a bipinnate muscle. With a multipinnate muscle, you have multiple branches of a tendon. So now we don't just have one tendon, we have multiple tendons, and again, the fibers are coming in at an angle to each of these tendons. And an example of a multipinnate muscle is the deltoid muscle in your shoulder. So because the fascicles are coming in at an angle to the tendon, these muscles cannot shorten as much as a parallel muscle can. But pinnate muscles tend to have more muscle fibers because they're coming in at an angle, you can fit more in, and this allows them to produce more overall tension than a parallel muscle. And the last type of fascicle arrangement is found in circular muscles. And in circular muscles, the fascicles are concentrically arranged around an opening, so that means they encircle an opening. These types of muscles are also called sphincters. And if these muscles contract, you decrease the size of the opening. So shown over here, an example is the orbicularis oris muscle around your mouth. So if they contract, you're going to narrow that opening in the middle, and if they're relaxed, the opening will become larger. And so the orbicularis oris is the muscle that you use to pucker your lips. So you can imagine that if a muscle that surrounded your mouth contracts, it's going to make the opening to your mouth smaller and pucker your lips out. In this section, we're going to look at lever or lever systems. So my husband is from the UK, and they say lever, and Americans tend to say lever. But I've been married long enough that I tend to jump back and forth between lever and lever, so sorry if I use both constantly. So before we get started with the lever systems, keep in mind that not every muscle in the body is part of a lever system, but those that are can increase our ability to exert force more than our muscles would be able to alone. So first, let's talk about what is a lever or a lever. So a lever is a rigid structure that moves on a fixed point, which is called a fulcrum. So there are several examples here. When you use a wheelbarrow, you're using a lever system. And when you're using like a crowbar or something else to pry something, again, you're using a lever system, and a seesaw is also a good example. So the force to move the lever is the applied force. We mentioned already the lever itself is the rigid structure. So that's the structure that's not moving. And the fulcrum is the fixed point around which you get movement. So there are three characteristics of levers that make them very useful. One, they can change the direction of an applied force. So the best example of this is like using a lever to move a rock, like a crowbar. You're pushing downward to move the rock upwards. So you're changing the direction of the force. They can also change the distance and speed of movement that is produced by the force. And they can change the effective strength of the force. And a good example of that one is like with the wheelbarrow. You don't have to exert as much force to move a very heavy load as if you were carrying the load itself. So it allows a smaller force to actually be effectively larger. So in the body, which is what we're focused on, bones act as the levers, so they are the rigid structures. The joints in our body act as the fulcrum, and remember the fulcrum is the point around which the movement occurs, so the fixed point. And the muscles provide the applied force, which is the effort to cause the movement. So for example, if we lift up something with our forearm, shown in both of these pictures, we've got applied force provided by our muscles. We have a fulcrum, which is our joint around which we're moving. And then another term that we need to be familiar with is load, which is the weight or force that is providing resistance to the movement. So the load or the resistance is always moving in the opposite direction as the force. So this would be like something you were holding in your hands, for example. And then don't forget the lever itself is the bone. So in this case, it would be like your forearm bones, your ulna and your radius. So there are three classes of levers that we're going to talk about next. So with a first class lever, the fulcrum, so again that's your joint, lies between the applied force and the load. So a non-body example would be like a seesaw or a pry bar. So the fulcrum, which is the point around which you're moving, is in the middle. So it's between the applied force at one end and the load or weight or resistance at the other end. An example of this in the body is the extension of the neck. And if we take a closer look at the extension of the neck, the load is the weight of the head, as shown by the purple arrow pointing down. The fulcrum, which is the fixed point, would be the atlanto-occipital joint. So that was the joint between the atlas and the occipital bone that allows your head to move up and down like you're nodding your head. And the applied force would be the posterior neck muscles. And so again, notice that the key point here is that the fulcrum is in between the load and the applied force. So the first class lever system is not that common in the body, but when you're trying to remember the difference between the three classes, keep in mind that with the first class lever, the fulcrum is in the middle. So the fulcrum is between the load and the force. With a second class lever, the load is in the middle. So the load lies between the force and the fulcrum. A non-body example would be the wheelbarrow. So the load would be something inside the wheelbarrow. The fulcrum would be the point around that front wheel. And the applied force would be you raising the handlebars. So again, in this case, the load is in the middle. With a second class lever, a very small force can move a large weight, but you do sacrifice some speed and distance. So for example, you can put a very heavy load inside of a wheelbarrow and move it with very little force, something that you probably wouldn't even be able to pick up on your own, but you have to move rather slow, and you move it in small increments at a time. In the body, the example of a second class lever would be extension at the ankle, which is also called plantar flexion. So let's take a closer look at this and see how the forces are aligned. So with ankle extension, the load is the weight of the body coming down the tibia, which is shown in the purple arrow. The fulcrum is going to be the metatarsal phalanx joint. So I know that during ankle extension, you're thinking the joint involved is the ankle joint, and that is a joint involved in the movement. But remember that a fulcrum is a fixed point, a point that doesn't move. And with ankle extension, the ankle joint actually moves upward. So the part that is fixed and not moving is going to be that part, so like you're standing on your toes. So it's going to be the joint between the metatarsal and the proximal phalanx is the part that's not moving. That's the fixed point. The applied force is the calf muscles, like the gastrocnemius and the soleus, which are exerting force upwards. And so again, notice that the load is in the middle with a second-class lever system. So the second-class lever systems are again not that common in the body. And again, when trying to remember the difference between the three types, remember that in this type, the load is in the middle between the applied force and the fulcrum. And the final type is the third-class lever, in which the force is in the middle between the load and the fulcrum. So there's a few non-body examples holding tongs, using a fishing rod, using a catapult. We'll look at the tong example. So if you hold a pair of tongs to get something like, say, you're grilling meat on a grill and you're picking up a hamburger patty with the tongs, the fulcrum is going to be the point at which the tongs move. So that's the end of the tongs. The force is going to be the force that you're applying with your hands, and the load is going to be the weight of whatever you're picking up. So again, the force is in the middle. So with this type of lever system, your speed and your distance increase more than the effective force. So with the second-class lever, a small force was able to move a big load. With the third-class lever, you're not as able to move as large a load, but you have more variability in your speed and distance. And an example of this type of lever in the body is elbow flexion. So let's take a closer look at this. So with elbow flexion, the load is going to be the weight of your forearm and your hand and whatever you might be holding in your hand, like a weight or a glass or a book. The fulcrum is going to be the elbow joint, and the applied force will be your anterior arm muscles, for example, your biceps brachii. And so because the biceps brachii and the other flexors of the elbow are on the anterior side, so they're in front of the humerus, that puts them in the middle between the fulcrum and the load. So the take-home point with the third-class lever is that the applied force is in the middle of the fulcrum and the load. This is the most common type of lever in the body. So when in doubt, if you're trying to figure out what type of lever it is, third class is the best guess because it is the most common. And then again, remember that with this type of lever, the applied force is in the middle. In this section, we're going to look at muscle system terminology. So muscle movement usually involves one end of the muscle being fixed in place, meaning it doesn't really move much, and the other end moves toward the fixed end. So origin is the term that we use to describe the place where the fixed end of the muscle is attached to bone, cartilage, or connective tissue. Usually muscles are attached to bone, but in some cases they may be attached to cartilage or the connective tissue that holds different areas of the body together. So the origin is going to be the less movable end. So if we look at the biceps brachii in your upper arm as an example, its origin is two different places on the scapula. Right? So the scapula would be the part that when the biceps brachii contracts, the scapula doesn't move. So that is the fixed end or the origin. The insertion is the movable end of the muscle. So again, if we look at the biceps brachii, it inserts onto the radius, onto that radial tuberosity. And so when the biceps brachii contracts, it pulls on the radius and moves it towards its fixed end. So a good rule of thumb to remember is that the origin is usually proximal to the insertion point, at least in your appendages. So in your arms and legs, the origin will be closer to the point of attachment to the axial skeleton, and the distal end would be more likely to be the insertion. Also, the origin or insertion are based on movements from the anatomical position. So treating the anatomical position as the starting place when you're determining if something is moving or not. So actions are movements provided by a muscle when it contracts. So when you're describing actions, make sure you're using terminology from Chapter 9. If you need to, go back to Chapter 9 and review this terminology. So we're talking about terms like flexion, extension, adduction, abduction, protraction, retraction, elevation, depression, lateral rotation, medial rotation, circumduction, pronation, supination, inversion, eversion, lateral flexion, opposition, and reposition. So don't just say this muscle moves the arm. That is not enough information. You need to use exact terminology to describe what a muscle is doing. Also, actions must include both a movement term, so like one of these movement terms, and the joint involved. For example, we would say flexion at the elbow or elbow flexion. So we're including both a movement and the joint at which the movement occurs. Some muscles can do multiple actions depending on what joint you're referencing, so that's why it's important to include both of these pieces of information. So to give you an example of this, the rectus femoris, which is one of the quadriceps femoris muscles that we'll talk about later, the rectus femoris can extend the knee, but it can also flex the hip. So just saying extends or flexes when talking about this muscle doesn't provide enough information because it can do both, but at different joints. So if you're looking at the knee joint, the rectus femoris is an extender, but if you're looking at the hip joint, the rectus femoris is a flexor. So muscles also usually work in groups, so it's not usually just one muscle that does one job within the body. Usually you have a large muscle or muscles that is the primary responsible or the primary mover for a major movement. And then you've got smaller muscles that can contract to get the larger muscle into an optimal length to produce maximum tension. So if you remember back in Chapter 10, we talked about the length-tension relationship and how if a muscle is too short, it can't generate enough tension. If it's too long, it can't generate any tension. It needs to be right in the middle in that Goldilocks zone of the optimal length to get optimal tension. And so smaller muscles will usually assist and help the larger muscle get into the exact right length that the larger muscle can then exert its maximum possible force towards a particular movement. So some terminology related to this. An agonist is a prime mover. So this is the muscle whose contraction is mostly responsible for producing a specific movement. So for example, the biceps brachii is the prime mover or the agonist for flexion at the elbow. A synergist is a smaller muscle whose contraction helps the larger agonist work more efficiently. So it can do this by providing additional pull at the insertion point. It can also stabilize the point of origin. And these synergists usually are the most useful at the start of a movement, so they help to get that larger muscle into the correct position and length so that it can do its best job. So the synergists usually work first, and then the agonist kicks in and does the largest portion of the movement. So for example, the brachioradialis and the brachialis are both muscles that help the biceps brachii flex the elbow. So if we look at this example again, we're looking at an agonist and a synergist example, and we're looking at elbow flexion, which is, again, we're flexing the elbow, we're bringing the forearm up closer to the shoulder. So for elbow flexion, the biceps brachii is the prime mover. It is the agonist. It is the main muscle. But the brachioradialis and the brachialis, which you can only see if you cut the biceps away, these two muscles are synergists that actually help with elbow flexion. So they help with pulling on the forearm. They also help stabilizing the insertion and origin point. So they are synergists. So we've already talked about agonists. Agonists are those prime movers that are mostly responsible for producing a movement. The opposite of an agonist is an antagonist. An antagonist is a muscle whose action opposes the action of a particular agonist. So for example, the triceps brachii is an agonist for extending the elbow. Remember, we talked about biceps brachii flexes the elbow. So we're talking about opposite actions. Biceps brachii flexes, triceps brachii extends. So that makes the triceps brachii an antagonist of the biceps brachii and vice versa. So agonist and antagonist are functional opposites. It can often be easiest to learn muscles when you're pairing them up in agonist and antagonist pairs. So again, a couple of examples. So if we're talking about movement at the elbow, if we're going to flex the elbow, the biceps brachii would be the agonist. That would be the main mover. But the triceps brachii would be the antagonist because it's the muscle that would oppose this movement. And then conversely, if we wanted to extend or lengthen the elbow, the triceps brachii would be the agonist or the main extender, and the biceps brachii would be the antagonist because its action opposes extension. All right, so this is what we mean by them being functional opposites. Another example is in the leg. So if we look at movement at the knee, so if you flex your knee, which is like bringing your knee back toward your hip, your hamstring group, which is a group of muscles on the back of the leg that we'll talk about later, these guys would be the agonists. They would be the prime movers. And the quadriceps group, which is on the front of the leg, would be the antagonist because they oppose this movement. And then if you extend your knee, which would straighten your leg, the quadriceps group on the front side would be the agonists. They would be the main movers, and we're going to talk about all four muscles that make up that group later. And the hamstring group on the back would be the antagonist that would be opposing that movement. So for every movement, you have an opposite movement, and the muscle that does the opposite movement would be the antagonist of the agonist that does the primary movement. One other term is fixator. A fixator is a specific type of synergist that assists an agonist by preventing movement at another joint. So basically it is stabilizing the origin of the agonist by fixing another joint or bone in place. An example would be the trapezius, which fixates the scapula in place when you flex your elbow. So reminder, the origin of the biceps brachii is on the scapula, right? And we've talked already several slides about how the biceps brachii is responsible for flexing the elbow. So it's attached to the scapula. So if we want it to be able to move at its insertion point, we want to make sure that its origin point is not moving. So the trapezius is a fixator for the scapula when the biceps brachii is being used. So that means the trapezius holds the scapula in place so that it doesn't move, so that it remains stable as the origin point for the biceps brachii while it's flexing the elbow. So a fixator is stabilizing the origin of the agonist. There is also a table in your textbook, table 11.1 on page 343. You're not going to be tested on all of these terms, but they can help you when it comes to memorizing the 36 muscles you need to know for lab and lecture. So it would behoove you to take a look at this table. You can see that muscle names can include terms that indicate specific regions of the body. So a muscle with abdominal in the name is going to be located in the abdomen, right? A muscle that has cutaneous in the name is going to be located close to the skin. Costal would be related to the ribs, etc. You also have terms that can indicate the position, direction, or fascicle arrangement. So if you see the term anterior, that muscle is going to be on the front. If you see the term inferior, that muscle will be below something. Oblique means it's slanting, etc. You can also have terms that indicate the structural characteristics. So some terms can describe the nature of origin. So biceps actually means the muscle has 2 heads. Triceps means it has 3 heads, etc. Some terms can tell you about the shape of the muscle, like pectinate. Orbicularis would be a circle. The piriformis would be a pear-shaped muscle, etc. You can also have other striking features of muscles, like alba means white, and lati means wide, latissimus means widest, etc. And then you can also have terms that indicate the actions. So an abductor would do some type of abduction, an extensor would do some type of extension. And then there are a few specific terms, like a buccinator is actually a term that stands for a trumpeter, and when we talk about that muscle, we'll see that that's the muscle that helps trumpet players blow on their trumpet. So learning these terms can help you with the memorization of the muscles. In this section, we'll start looking at the muscles you need to know for both lecture and lab, starting with the head and neck muscles. And remember, as you're memorizing these, you only need to know as much detail as what is shown on these slides. So we'll start with the face muscles, and the first face muscle that we'll look at is the buccinator. So the buccinator is actually underneath some of these other muscles, so in order to really see the origin and insertion, I've provided a separate little picture down here where we've taken some of the other muscles away. So the buccinator has its origin on the maxilla, which is the upper jawbone, and the mandible, which is the lower jawbone. And it inserts onto the orbicularis oris muscle, which is a muscle that surrounds the mouth. And so when the buccinator contracts, it compresses your cheeks. So think about the motion that you need to like suck on something or to play a trumpet or other type of musical instrument. And the buccinator is also often called a musician's muscle because it's necessary, for example, for playing the trumpet. So here's the buccinator is highlighted in both of these images. Again, it's a little hard to see when the masseter is showing because it's behind the masseter, but this little picture at the bottom can help you as well. So the buccinator is important for musicians, and it's also important for infants to enable them to suck at a bottle or a breast. The next facial muscle is the orbicularis oris. So remember, oris is a root word that means mouth. So this tells you this is a circular muscle that goes around the mouth. So if I highlight it here on both images, it is this round muscle around the lips. So it originates on the maxilla and mandible as well. And it inserts into the tissue that makes up your lips. So when it contracts, again, it's a circular muscle. So remember, it's going to narrow when it contracts. So it's going to compress and purse your lips. So think about the motion that you do when you're about to kiss someone. That is the pursing of the lips. The next muscle is the orbicularis oculi. Oculi is a root word that means eye. So this is the round muscle that goes around the eye. So it originates on the medial margin of the orbit, and it inserts into the skin around the eyelids. When this muscle contracts, it closes your eye. Again, remember, when circular muscles contract, they narrow the opening inside of them, so this will close the eye. It does not open the eye. That is other muscles entirely. It only closes the eye. And there's the orbicularis oculi highlighted in both images. So if we look at the jaw muscles, the first big jaw muscle is the masseter. In fact, the masseter is the strongest of all of the jaw muscles, and this is a very important muscle that you use for chewing, which is also called mastication. So I've highlighted the masseter on the left image and the right image. You can feel this muscle contract if you put your hand on your cheek and clench your jaw. You can feel the masseter contracting. So it originates on the zygomatic arch, which we covered back in earlier chapters, and it inserts onto the mandible, a specific part of the mandible called the ramus. So when it contracts, it elevates the mandible, so it brings the mandible up. So imagine again, if you open your mouth and then you close it, that closing action is going to be the action of the masseter. Other muscles are involved in opening the mouth. So the masseter, you're going to elevate your mandible. So again, remember to learn these specific actions. The next jaw muscle is the temporalis, and the temporalis is shown here. It's on the side of the head where your temporal bone is. In fact, its origin is the temporal bone, and then its insertion is that coronoid process of the mandible. So the part of the mandible that looked like a little shark's fin that we talked about back in chapter 7. So that's where the temporalis inserts. So it also pulls the jaw upwards, so it elevates the mandible. And again, if you put your hand on the side of your head and clench your jaw, you can feel the temporalis muscle contract. And then there's one neck muscle we're going to have you know, and that's the sternocleidomastoid. So the sternocleidomastoid is this long muscle on either side of your neck. And it actually has two heads, so it inserts in two different places. Or I'm sorry, it has an origin in two different places. So one of its origins is on the clavicle, and one of its origins is on the sternum. So the first part of its name, sternocleido, tell you where its origins are. And the specific part of the sternum that it originates on is the manubrium of the sternum, which, if you remember, the manubrium is that top part of the sternum. Then it inserts behind your ear on the mastoid process of the temporal bone. So remember the mastoid process, this is from chapter 7, is that big bump behind your ear. That is where the sternocleidomastoid inserts, and that is also in the name. So when you flex both the left and right sternocleidomastoids together, you will flex your neck. So that's like bringing your head down toward your chest. So neck flexion is what happens when they both contract together. If you just contract one sternocleidomastoid on one side, it will flex the head toward the shoulder on the side that you're contracting and rotate your face to face the opposite side. So that's what it does if you just contract one of them. Both of them together will flex your neck. In this section, we'll look at some abdominal muscles. And the first one of these for you to know is the external oblique. So the external oblique is going to be the muscle that's like on the side of your abdomen, so it comes in at an angle. It originates on ribs 5 through 12. It inserts onto the iliac crest, which is part of the ilium, which is part of the hip bone. And when it contracts, it compresses the abdomen, depresses the ribs, and flexes the spine. So think of doing a sit-up. Also, you have the rectus abdominis, which is shown here. This is what we call a parallel muscle that has tendinous bands, so it has these white bands that run through it. It originates on a portion of the pubis bone, which is also part of the hip bone. It inserts onto the costal cartilage of ribs 5 through 7, as well as the xiphoid process of the sternum. And it has the same action as the external oblique, so it compresses the abdomen, depresses the ribs, and flexes the spine. The rectus abdominis is commonly referred to as just your abs, or if it's well defined, it can be called a six-pack. Of course, now that you're an A&P student, you're going to call it the rectus abdominis. In this section, we'll look at the pectoral girdle and upper limb muscles. And remember, the pectoral girdle is composed of the clavicle and scapula. So first, some pectoral girdle muscles, starting with the levator scapulae. So the levator scapulae is highlighted here. The picture on the left is an anterior view, so you can see it right here. And the picture on the right is a posterior view where you can see a better view of it. So it originates on C1 to C4, and it inserts onto the scapula. And again, that's most easily seen from the posterior view. And its action is that it elevates the scapula. So the name gives this one away. Levator scapulae, levitates or elevates the scapula. The next one is the serratus anterior, and that one is shown here on the left in the anterior view, and then again you can see part of it on the posterior view. The serratus anterior originates on ribs 1 through 8, and it inserts onto the scapula, and it protracts the shoulder. So that's like moving your shoulder forward. And the serratus anterior, the name comes from serrated, like a serrated knife, because if you look at some images of this muscle by itself, the front of it has a serrated or jagged edge, and so that is where the name comes from. That can help you remember that one. The next one is the trapezius. The trapezius is a very long diamond-shaped muscle on the back, and in this picture here on the right of the posterior view, on the left side, we can see the trapezius. Notice that it's on both sides, but the left side is showing the superficial dissection, the right side is showing the deep dissection. So we're only seeing half of the trapezius. So the trapezius would look like this on both sides. And if you go back earlier in the presentation, you can see another image I showed earlier of the trapezius. You can also see a little bit of the trapezius that comes over the shoulder, and you can see from the anterior side as well. So the trapezius originates on the occipital bone, the ligamentum nuchae, which is that ligament that connects the cervical vertebrae, and it also originates on the thoracic vertebrae. And then it wraps around and inserts on the clavicle and the scapula, and it has several actions. It can elevate, retract, depress, and rotate the scapula. It can elevate the clavicle. And probably the one that's the easiest to remember is that it extends the neck. So it would be the antagonist to the sternocleidomastoid, which flexes the neck. So now let's look at the upper arm muscles, starting with the deltoid. So the deltoid is the big muscle in your shoulder. It originates on both the clavicle and the scapula, and it inserts onto the humerus. And if the entire deltoid muscle contracts all at once, so this one is a multi-pinnate muscle. It has 3 tendons, one in the front, one on the lateral side, and one on the posterior side. And so if all 3 sections contract at once, you'll get abduction of the shoulder. So remember, abduction is moving away from the midline of the body. If just the anterior portion of it contracts, you'll get flexion of the shoulder and medial rotation of the shoulder. And if just the posterior portion contracts, you'll get extension of the shoulder and lateral rotation of the shoulder. Then we also have the teres major. You can see a little bit of it from the anterior view, but most of this one is easily seen from the posterior view on the right side. The teres major originates on the scapula and inserts on the humerus, and it participates in extension of the shoulder, adduction of the shoulder, which is bringing the shoulder back to the midline, and medial rotation of the shoulder. The pectoralis major, your large chest muscle, this is sometimes referred to colloquially as the pecs, but remember for quizzes, exams, fill-in-the-blank questions, lab, and anything in general while you're an A&P student, you need to use the entire name of the muscle, so you need to call it the pectoralis major. This one originates on the cartilage of ribs 2 through 6, as well as the sternum and the clavicle, and it inserts onto the humerus. So the pectoralis major flexes the shoulder, adducts the shoulder, and allows medial rotation of the shoulder. The latissimus dorsi is a large back muscle, and so you can see that on the right picture here, where you can see the latissimus dorsi. The pectoralis major is only visible from the anterior view. The latissimus dorsi is colloquially known as the lats, so bodybuilders will refer to this as their lats, but again, while in A&P, make sure to use the entire name of the muscle. The latissimus dorsi originates on the thoracic and lumbar vertebrae, as well as ribs 8 through 12, and it also inserts on the humerus. So it is opposite of the shoulder in that it extends the shoulder, whereas the pectoralis major flexes the shoulder, but the other two actions are the same. It also adducts the shoulder and medially rotates the shoulder. So if we move down into the forearm, we have the biceps brachii. So if we look at these two arm pictures, the one on the left is a posterior view, the one on the right is an anterior view. So we can see the biceps brachii if we look at the anterior view, and it has two heads. That's where the biceps part comes from. Again, a lot of people just call this their biceps, but while you're in A&P, to get full credit, like on any fill-in-the-blank questions or any lab practical answers, you must call it the biceps brachii, because there's actually other muscles in the body that use the term biceps as well. So the origin for the biceps brachii we mentioned earlier is on the scapula, and it inserts onto the radius, and it allows flexion of the elbow. It also helps with flexion of the shoulder, and it participates in supination of the forearm. Then if we look at the triceps brachii, again, a lot of people just call this the triceps, but while you're in this class, you need to call it the triceps brachii. This one is visible on the posterior side. It has three heads, although only two of them are shown in this image. It originates on the scapula, so one head connects to the scapula, one head connects to the humerus, and it inserts onto the olecranon of the ulna. So remember, that's the point of the ulna that forms your elbow. And the triceps brachii allows extension at the elbow, extension at the shoulder, and adduction at the shoulder. Then we also have the brachioradialis, which is shown, you can see it both in the anterior and the posterior view. This one originates on the humerus. It inserts onto the styloid process of the radius. So the brachioradialis tells you it's on the same side as your radius. And this one helps with flexion at the elbow. So it was one of those synergists for elbow flexion. Moving farther down, we have the flexor carpi ulnaris, which is going to be on the side of your pinky, because remember the ulna is on the same side as your pinky, and this one has ulnaris in the name, which tells you that it is going to be on the pinky side. Flexor gives you a hint about what it does. So the flexor carpi ulnaris, this one originates on the medial epicondyle of the humerus as well as the ulna, and it inserts on the carpals and the fifth metacarpal. So when this muscle contracts, you're going to get flexion of the wrist and adduction of the wrist. The extensor carpi ulnaris is going to be on the other side of the ulna, but again, it's still on the ulna side of the arm. It originates on the lateral epicondyle of the humerus as well as the ulna, and it inserts onto the fifth metacarpal. This one allows for extension of the wrist, and again, look at the name, it gives you a clue, and also adduction of the wrist. They're both going to be adduction because they're both on the pinky side, so they'll cause the hand to move toward the midline of the body, which would be in the direction of the pinky. Go back to chapter 9 to review the different motions if you've forgotten them. And then we have the extensor digitorum, which is highlighted here. This is on the back of the arm, so we're looking at the posterior view. You can see it over here on this posterior view as well, but you can't really see it on the anterior view. So the extensor digitorum originates on the humerus. It inserts onto phalanges 2 through 5, and the name tells you what this does, extensor digits, so it extends your digits. In other words, it extends your fingers, and it also extends your wrist. And then this is the last section where we're going to look at muscles of the lower limbs. We'll start with the thigh muscles, and we'll start with the gluteus maximus, which is your big butt muscle. Sometimes exercise and bodybuilders will just refer to this as their glutes, but again, we're using the entire terms while we're in A&P, and we're calling it the gluteus maximus. So it originates on the ilium of the hip bone, as well as the sacrum and the coccyx, and it inserts onto the femur. And this one is responsible for extension at the hip and lateral rotation at the hip. Then we have the tensor fasciae latae. This one is this muscle that's on the side here. that goes down and joins up with this iliotibial tract, so this little short muscle at the top. It originates on the ilium of the hip bone, and it inserts onto this iliotibial tract, which is this band of collagenous fibers. The tensor fasciae latae flexes the hip and medially rotates the hip, and it also provides lateral support for the knee. We also have the adductor longus, which is shown right here on this image. It originates on the pubis of the hip bone and inserts onto the femur. And this muscle is responsible for adduction of the hip, flexion of the hip, and medial rotation of the hip. The name will allow you to remember at least one of the actions. Then we have the gracilis, which is this long, skinny muscle that's on the inside or medial part of the thigh. The gracilis originates on the pubis of the hip bone and inserts way down on the tibia. So it goes past the femur and inserts way below on the tibia. The gracilis acts to flex the knee. It also works to adduct the hip and medially rotate the hip. We also have the sartorius, which runs at a diagonal, so it runs from the lateral side of the hip down to the medial side down here close to the knee. And so the origination point is actually the ilium on the hip bone, and then again it wraps around, goes medially, and then inserts on the medial side of the tibia. And the sartorius helps with flexion of the knee and flexion of the hip and lateral rotation of the hip. So now we're going to look at two groups of muscles, and the first one is the group called the quadriceps femoris. So there are 4 muscles in this group. That's where the term quad or quads come from. So the first of these is the rectus femoris, which you can see all of these are going to be on the anterior side of the thigh. And the rectus femoris is going to be the big one right in the middle. The rectus femoris originates on the ilium of the hip, and it inserts onto the tibia. And it's responsible for extension of the knee and flexion of the hip. Then we have the vastus lateralis, which is the muscle on the lateral side. So again, on the side away from the midline of the body. This one originates on the femur, inserts on the tibia, and extends the knee. Then we have the vastus medialis, which is going to be on the medial side. So you've got your rectus femoris in the middle. The vastus lateralis is going to be to its lateral side. The vastus medialis will be on its medial side. This one also originates on the femur and inserts on the tibia. And this one also works to extend the knee. And then the fourth muscle in this group is the vastus intermedius. This one you can't see unless you pull the rectus femoris off. So the rectus femoris sits on top of it. So if I were to take the rectus femoris off, I could see the vastus intermedius underneath it. So if we look at this cross section over here, right, here's the rectus femoris right here in front, and the vastus intermedius is sitting behind it. So the vastus intermedius also originates on the femur, inserts on the tibia, and extends the knee. So notice that all 4 muscles of this group all work to extend the knee. And then the largest of the 4 muscles, the rectus femoris, can also help with flexion at the hip. So collectively, these 4 muscles are known as the quadriceps femoris. And again, people who are into exercise and fitness will abbreviate these the quads. But you must know the names of all 4 individual muscles as well as the name of the whole group. Another very big group is called the hamstrings, and this one contains 3 muscles. So now we're looking at the back of the leg. So the quadriceps were on the anterior side of the leg. The hamstrings are on the posterior side. And so the first one of these, this is going to be the one that is most lateral, so closest to the outside of the leg. And that is called the biceps femoris. This is why you can't just say biceps for this class. You've got to be specific. So this one is the biceps femoris. It originates on the ischium of the hip bone and the femur, and it inserts onto both the tibia and the fibula. And this, the biceps femoris helps with flexion at the knee, as well as extension at the hip and lateral rotation at the hip. The next one is called the semimembranosus, and that one is highlighted here. The semimembranosus is on the medial side, and it actually sits behind this other muscle that we're about to talk about called the semitendinosus. But so it's the most medial of this group. It originates on the ischium of the hip bone. It inserts onto the tibia. It also does flexion at the knee, extension at the hip, but because it's on the medial side, this one helps with medial rotation at the hip. Remember, biceps femoris was on the lateral side, and it does lateral rotation of the hip. And then you have the semitendinosus, which is now has a red box around the name here. So this one you can kind of think of as being in between the biceps femoris and the semimembranosus. And the semitendinosus kind of actually also sits a little bit on top of the semimembranosus. So it originates on the ischium, inserts on the tibia, and it does very similar functions as the semimembranosus. It flexes the knee, it extends the hip, and it medially rotates the hip. So for all three of these muscles, learn them in a group because it will help you remember they all flex the knee and they all extend the hip. Now, two of them do lateral, medial rotation, and one of them does lateral rotation, but the other two functions they all share. And this entire group is called the hamstrings, and you've probably heard that term. You've probably heard someone say they've pulled a hamstring. If you hear that, that means they've done some damage to one of these three muscles, but you need to know the actual muscle names of all three of these muscles, and that they are collectively known as the hamstrings. And then the last little section are ankle and foot muscles. So we're going to start with the tibialis anterior. So the name should tell you some of the information about it. Like it originates on the tibia and it's on the anterior side of the lower leg. So it's shown here in the image. It originates on the tibia. It inserts down on the tarsals and the first metatarsal, and it's responsible for flexion at the ankle and inversion of the ankle. And then we have the gastrocnemius, which is your largest calf muscle. So it's the big calf muscle in the back of your lower leg. So you can see it in all three pictures here. The gastrocnemius originates on the femur. It inserts on the calcaneus, which is that large tarsal that makes up your heel. And the gastrocnemius is responsible for extension at the ankle, inversion of the ankle, and also flexion at the knee. And the last muscle would be the soleus. This is also a calf muscle. It sits underneath the gastrocnemius. So in the lateral pictures, you can see it's deeper than the gastrocnemius. And then in the posterior picture here, you can see it peeking out from underneath the gastrocnemius. And then if you cut the gastrocnemius away, you can see the soleus underneath it. The soleus originates on the fibula and the tibia. It inserts also on the calcaneus, and it helps with extension at the ankle. And that is it for Chapter 11. So remember that Chapter 11 is only going to be about 20% of Exam 3. So make sure it's only about 20% of your total study time while preparing for Exam 3.